Hi, my name's Rachel. I'm part of the CU here in Nottingham and also a student at the university studying theology. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you today to a panel about race and racism and racial injustices and the events that we saw throughout 2020, but also into this year as well. We're joined today by Israel and Elliot, and I'm just going to allow them to introduce themselves. So, Elliot, why don't you introduce yourself first?
Yeah, my name is Elliot. I'm a UCCF staff worker. Nobody knows what that means, but basically, I have the privilege of having conversations with students about the biggest questions we face, really, questions that humans have been grappling with forever, questions of meaning, progress, pain, justice. Yes, that's what I do for work. I'm married to a lovely white Northern Irish woman. She's a doctor. She's called Gillian. And we together are parents to beautiful mixed race babies, obviously. Eliza is 3, nearly 4, and Remy is 2. So that's me.
Thanks, Elliot. And what about you, Israel? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. My name is Israel. I'm from London, but currently in St. Louis, Missouri, the United States. I'm studying for my master's in theology. I grew up in London and part of an organization called Black Berea. And Black Berea is an organization that really sort of was birthed out of a desire to address the particular needs of the Black British community. Primarily in London, but we've been branching out and trying to engage the Black British community in other regions of England too. And so part of my reason for being in the US is continuing to dive deeper into the academic discipline of theology. And I felt it'd be actually really good to spend some time outside of the UK to be able to actually see what the issues look like from another vantage point, to step out and sort of look from the outside. And so it's been a really great time. So far, I've been here for coming to 2 years. Got married last summer to Rachel Robinson, now Rachel Collade. And so, yeah, we married for just over 6 months. And so it's been a great time. We had a COVID wedding, which will be a story to tell for generations. But yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much, Israel and Elliot, for both joining us today. I think as part of our events week, our theme is pause. So we're pausing and reflecting on some of, just the biggest moments of this past year and how we can bring that into this new year as well. I think as I pause and reflect back onto 2020, one of the defining moments and which continues to impact my life daily was the ignition of a global, really, civil rights movement, sparked, I guess, in part by the brutal murder of George Floyd, which happened, I think, last May now. We saw worldwide protests. We all signed petitions. There was an urge, a real surge on government to take action. And I know I made a lot of personal commitments to understanding my own white privilege, seeking to amplify Black voices, to go through a process of learning and unlearning so much. I had a lot of confronting conversations with white friends and Black friends alike. And I guess just reflecting back as well on the impact of COVID-19 and how that has disproportionately affected Black and minority ethnic groups. It has sometimes left me in a real whirlwind, thinking about how I can amplify Black voices, social media activism, and also processing the muddling emotions of being in lockdown and getting coronavirus and also being a university student. And I guess some of what this panel wants to do is frame a conversation to say that racism matters and it's something to be talked about, and being part of Christian Union, and watching this today. You may be a Christian, you may not be. We're a majority white Christian Union, so it's great that we can hear from two Black men. I guess where I want to start is, as you guys pause and reflect on the events of last year, what are some of the moments that stand out most to you? For that, Elliot, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I suppose so much has happened. It's hard to point to one specific moment that has stood out. And in lots of ways, there's more information out there than there has ever been. So some of the, as stuff was happening over the summer, I was reading David Olusoga's book, Black British, on kind of the history of Black people in Britain going back over 1,000 years, and well to kind of Roman times even. So there's so much information out there historically. There's information that we can just see right in front of our faces, like the YouTube clips and the George Floyd killing, and the protests, and then, like you say, the COVID inequalities and the resurfacing of the Windrush scandal. My grandparents came across from Jamaica within that Windrush moment in British history, and then thinking about systemic racism. Over the summer, I did one of those DNA tests to trace your heritage, and it and so I've always known my Jamaican roots and Caribbean roots, but my DNA came back 60% Nigerian, West African, which means that at some point my family moved or was moved, if you understand what I mean. And so all of that in a mixing pot. And then on January the 6th, the siege of the Capitol building. And maybe this is the moment that sticks out to me, on the backdrop of all that racial thought. There's a guy walking through the Capitol riots in a Batman suit. I don't know if you've seen it on Twitter or YouTube, but he's wearing like a pretty convincing Batman suit, and it's just like mind-blowing and also comical in a way, but also you get a sense that we live in like the two different worlds. The guy who's able to wear a Batman suit to a siege on the seat of democracy in the United States. He feels he can do that, and then like a guy who allegedly is passing off a fake $20 bill gets killed. Like and that translates not just as kind of like data, but that's personal. Like I'm connected to that in many ways. And so yeah, it's not one particular moment. I'm grateful for my friends and family as we've kind of helped one another to respond and have some of those challenging conversations, like you say, Rachel. And I suppose settings like this where we can have honest, thoughtful reflections is so valuable. And so as a Black Christian, over the last 12 months, faith for me could have been undermined, or faith could have been confirmed. And I don't know if we've made progress when it comes to race over the last 12 months, but my experience in my faith has actually been strengthened as I've seen how Christian teaching addresses ethnicity, um, addresses our common humanity, addresses like the rejection of white supremacy, addresses what's wrong with us, um, yeah, and justice and reconciliation. And so yeah, a lot in the mix there. Um, yeah, lots of challenging and encouraging moments.
Yeah, I would. I think the events that stand out to me in the past, coming to the past year, which is crazy to think about, all on its own. But I think the one that was really personally shocking for me, but then I think watching. So there were two events. One was shocking for me, but watching the second, the one you mentioned, Rachel, George Floyd. The one that really shocked me was Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed by a civilian in southern Georgia. And the events happened in February, but the video camera taping was not released. The district attorney or county attorney chose not to press any charges. And it wasn't until May that all of that, the video was released, and then it caused outrage. And so what really stood out to me in that instance was what a phenomenon people have been mentioning is that in our social media age, it isn't that racial injustice is increasing, but it's being filmed. And for a long time, these things have been happening, but there's been no video to prove it. And without the video, people honestly actually say, does it really happen? Is it really that bad? And it takes a video to say, yes, now watch the video. It really is that bad. And I kept thinking, how many Ahmaud Arbery's are there who's were killed by civilians, who were killed by police, and there's no videotape to confirm it. And so it has to be left, to our imaginations to consider whether this indeed was an act of racial injustice or not. But George Floyd, I think, really garnered global attention because by that time, I believe this was end of May. I'm coming to the end of May. The world was essentially at standstill. We were still trying to figure out what to do with COVID. Nothing, everyone was in lockdown, so everyone was on their phone. And so to sit there and watch a man being pressed on his neck for 8 minutes, it's a very long time to watch that kind of tragedy, especially when it's real life. I mean, it wasn't a Marvel show where we're watching, Black Panther trying to fight a bad guy. This is a real tangible act of pain that's being inflicted on another person. And I think that shocked the world because it was just so unbelievable. And yeah, it was there for all to see and couldn't be denied. Now, for me, I think it rightly garnered global attention, but I think my personal mistake was actually watching the whole 8 minutes because it was very traumatic. And it actually isn't the first time something like that has happened. In 2014, for example, there was a teenage boy, Laquan McDonald, who was shot 16 times by a police officer. The video was buried. And that was the first mistake I ever made in terms of watching that kind of traumatic event, because you saw the first 2 bullets hit him and he fell. And then you saw another 2 bullets, and then another 2 bullets. And you just thought, it's clear to see that this guy is dead. And you kept firing bullets. And there's been other videos like that, other atrocities like that have really, because they've been taped, have come now to at least the US's national attention and global attention. And it really forces us to consider, one, what is the historical background to this, that such events can occur? And 2, what does that mean for us now? Recognizing that, especially as Christians, and I'll specify it to Christians now, especially as Christians, recognizing that we believe in the image of God in every human being. And yet we see in our world that image is being marred and disrespected and dishonored. What sense of calling do we have to uphold and to almost speak prophetically to the need to treat fully each human being as made in the image of God? I think that's the real task that the question of racial injustice is pressing on the Christian church. It's how can we show that irrespective of one's race, because they are fully made in the image of God, they are to be treated with dignity and respect at all times.
You bringing up Ahmaud Arbery as well, you know, we had 3 really shocking videos that came out at the end of May. We had Ahmaud Arbery's civilian shooting, and we had George Floyd, and the power struggle between the helplessness of those recording it against the abuse of power of the police officers. And then also we had the video, I don't know whether you remember, of Amy Cooper videoing Christian Cooper, the bird watcher, in New York, in Central Park.
Stop. Sir, I'm asking you to stop.
Please don't come close to me.
Sir, I'm asking you to stop recording me.
Please don't come close to me.
Please take your phone off.
Please don't come close to
And
me.
I'm taking pictures and calling the cops.
Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
And again, I think that really struck me, because she, as a white woman, knew the power that she had of calling this man on the phone to police, saying an African-American man is threatening me. And she was weaponizing her skin color against someone else's, someone who shared her same last name. Yes, they weren't related, but you know, they had a commonality even in that. And I really recognize, what really struck me is that the voice of, you know, a white woman had so much power in that situation. But how can I, as a Christian, speak out against racial injustices that we see, and really obvious racial and racism, but also more subtle nuances? And how do we bring that back into a UK where, you know, our government are declaring that racism isn't a thing anymore, that there's this diverse cabinet, but actually the experience on the ground is so different for our Black friends as well. So I guess during this time, I've had many conversations, I've asked many questions. What are some of the questions that you guys have been asked that you found particularly difficult to hear or to answer, or maybe just helpful to think through as well?
Do you want to go, Elliot?
Go on then. Yeah, I think probably because of the demographic of people that I rub shoulders with. Well, not this year. It's been virtual rubbing of shoulders, but yeah, I work with students, and so everything that's happened this year has been a bringing to the forefront of their mind something that they were already generally committed to. And so one of the questions, stated in a lot of different ways, but one of the biggest questions has been, how do we actually make progress on racism? Like, how do I deal with my own privileges? How do I deal with my own prejudices? How do I then challenge my friends? So on and so forth, so on and so forth. And in a way, that's encouraging. Like, I mean, when we all like look out into the world, we have to try and interpret what we see. And like, yeah, there's just so much data out there. The like being able to connect the dots, like even connecting the dots of the like stop and search data in London. We're all trying to make sense of what we see and what we feel, and we're trying to piece together a coherent story of our world. And like, we all need to know which way is up. we all want to make progress. And so I've been encouraged by the students that I'm around most of the time, because when they say progress, they don't just mean like technological progress or financial progress. Like the guy who turns up and says, yeah, I've managed to create a kind of shackle that we can place closer together, which means that we can get 400 black bodies on our lower decks, on the lower decks of our ships instead of 300. Like, that's a technological advancement. But what I think I'm seeing in students, whether Christian or not, is a desire for a like moral compass within progress. And so not just a blind technological drive, not just blind financial like building of financial wealth, but like a morality to all of that. Yeah. And so for me, that's like fairly encouraging that like students want to ask these questions and have these conversations about justice and equity, fairness, being anti-greed, racism, having compassion. Like, those are all moral categories. That's right and wrong, good and evil. And I studied at uni like over 10 years ago, and I know it doesn't look like it, but it was over 10 years ago. And I think there's a genuinely significant difference in outlook. Like, I think students today, like, they have a like cosmic care, a global care, a care about like how our world is doing, which includes, I think, how their fellow human beings who are black, how they're doing in the world. And so that need, yeah, that recognition of the need to make sense of the world with a moral compass, being compassionate, being anti-racism, anti-oppression, I think that's led to an openness to stuff that we're talking about over the whole week, faith, spirituality, like that. Those categories have a place within human progress. Yeah, and so like long story short, I'd say the question I've been asked the most is like, how do we make progress? And the question I've answered with, because I'm awkward like that, I don't really answer answer straight, is, have you ever paused long enough to consider what your story is? Like, to consider what story you're living by. And for me, I can talk about this for ages, but for me, that's brought back some interesting answers. But so Israel, why don't you respond? It'd be good to hear what you think.
Yeah, I think one question that I've received a fair amount in the past year, that I think it's a good question, but it shows, I think, a real need in the UK is the question, well, isn't the UK better, or we're not as bad as, because, you know, the majority of the attention is on the US. And so the question is, what about the UK? We're okay, right? I mean, we're not like them. And the truth is that at least the history of the UK is, to contrast it with the US's history of racial injustice was quote unquote on US soil. It was, white masters rubbing shoulders with black slaves. But the history of racial injustice in the UK has always been abroad for the most part. That is to say that the UK also had plantation fields, but they weren't, in Northumbria. The plantation fields were in Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. It was the Caribbean, it was West Africa, it was India. So like it was the same atrocities, at least when you look at the transatlantic slave era, but it was on a broad soil, foreign soil. And so it's easier, quote unquote, to think, oh, we're not as bad. When you walk down the streets of Nottingham, you don't see the relics of a slave plantation the way you might if you walk down the streets of South Carolina. It doesn't mean that the UK didn't have that history. And actually, when you examine it, you find it's really quite atrocious. And so that question really stands out to me. And I think it exposes a need to study a history of the UK that goes beyond, and the British Empire that goes beyond 1066, Battle of Hastings, Battle of Waterloo, you know, the Tudor times and Victorian, and to really expand and say what was the legacy of the British Empire globally, and to start there with a very honest accounting of British history. And so, Elliot, you mentioned this book already, but David Olusoga's Black and British, that's an amazing book. And I think it's a great place to start. I believe almost like 400 pages, 400, 500 pages, at least the hardback edition. But he goes and does a huge sweep of Black British history from, I think like the 4th century to the 20th. And that's a good, I think, exposure to the, I don't want to say alternative, but like a broader picture of British life that extends beyond what I think we probably saw growing up in our history classes. The other question I get is the connection between Christian spirituality, religious devotion, personal spiritual formation, sanctification, and justice. It's almost like, well, I'm a good person. I'm invested in the church. I am seeking to have a life conformed to the image of Christ. And, what is this burden that's being placed on me now in regards to justice? And even if I admit that this burden is there, I feel very powerless. Like, what am I meant to do? And one of the things I try to point people to in response to that question is to say, actually, the scriptures has a very rich tapestry of the Christian and spiritual life, the Christian spiritual life. It isn't the purpose of one's personal devotion to God was never meant to be restricted to almost the Sunday morning experience and a Bible study, but it's actually meant to permeate all of life, permeate your engagement with your whole community, permeate the way you walk through your university campus and the way you interact with every sphere or institution you interact with. And one passage that I think really shows this is Isaiah 58. Isaiah 58, the Lord is rebuking the nation of Israel because they've essentially bifurcated religious devotion and social justice. They've said, well, we fast and we pray and we engage in these religious devotions, Lord. So that means we're doing right in your sight. And the Lord says to them in verse 6 onwards, he rebukes them and says, I don't accept your fasting. I don't accept your prayer and religious devotion. Verse 6, is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? And it just keeps going on and on. And the idea there is that you cannot separate spiritual devotion from social engagement and from the concern for the welfare of all people and everyone that comes into your proximity, into your midst. And so I think the question then is really part of my own communion with God so the answer there is part of my communion with God to seek the welfare of the other, that the vertical relationship I have with God and the horizontal relationship I have with other people are interconnected. That one informs the other and the other informs the one. And so and I give that passage an example of just trying to step away from separating the questions of spirituality from the questions of justice, that they are interconnected.
Yeah, and just to tag on the back of that, I think it's important to recognize that, like you're saying, Israel, the Christianity isn't this individualistic, platitude of, hey, now I'm a Christian, I have to try harder and do this and do that. Like that's not even close to what we read in Scripture. Instead, what we actually read in Scripture is um, a story of how things really are in the world. A story that centers around this historical moment that's described as good news of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And all of that story not making sense of primarily like my life or just your life, but primarily making sense of the cosmos, making sense of every why question. And so one of the things that I say in response to the like, how do we make progress is like, okay, how do you explain what's wrong with us? Because there's something like out of sync, isn't there? There's something broken about all of us that shows up in racism, but also shows up in sexism and other kinds of hatred. But it just keeps showing up. How do you explain that? And actually, the way that you answer that really does matter. Because if it's not deep enough, if it's not wide enough, if it's not cosmic enough, then how do you know if you're doing help or doing harm when you're making progress? Surely we don't want to become like the oppressors that we're fighting against. You see, the Bible, in a way that I think is unique when it comes to Jesus, tells this cosmic story that includes the presence of evil, includes the presence of racism, but doesn't stop there. And another question I like to ask is how do you explain where humanity is heading? Like, what's our destiny? Progress towards what? What does equality and harmony and peace and reconciliation actually look like? And in a world that has never fully been at peace, why does it feel like those things are like old things that we have to rediscover rather than new things that we're trying to create? Friends tweeted a quote from an 18th century writer, and it just stuck with me this morning. He says this: "A man is the only animal that laughs and weeps, for he is the only animal that is struck with the difference between what things are and what things ought to be." Like, isn't that just stunning? That just hit me and kept me. Because we know that racism isn't how things ought to be. It's not human destiny for us to be hated or for our fellow human to hate us and to use power against us. That's not how things are meant to be. And that's significant, isn't it? Because if your picture of human destiny isn't beautiful enough, isn't glorious enough, isn't cosmic, then how do you know if you're making progress? Or more precisely, how do you know that the progress you're making is in the right direction? Because building a ship that can like keep more black bodies felt like progress at the time, I'm sure. And actually, the Bible offers this cosmic story of true progress, a movement from evil, selfish greed because of the person of Jesus to peace and harmony and life and light and self-giving love. Yeah, and so I think the Christian story does make sense of the kind of racial tension, but also our hope and expectation of peace. Yeah.
Thank you, Elliot. And you've highlighted really the reason why, as a Christian Union, we even wanted to host this panel, because we know that racism is not just about a social justice movement, and it's not just about battling what we're seeing in culture and in government, but it is a deep rooted issue that goes beyond just these surface level things and goes to the heart of God and who he is, that he As Christians, we believe that he is a God who is just and fair and has created everyone in his image. And the gospel offers a way to come back into right relationship with others, with the world, and ultimately with him. And as Christians, it is right for us to speak out against these injustices in the frame of the gospel, the good news of Jesus. I guess as we're just wrapping this up, is there any kind of parting kind of thoughts or resources that you'd recommend, or just something else that you want to share? One of the biggest things that I think I've learned at this time, and I must say I haven't reflected on in the past few months, and when I was asked to host this panel, I suddenly thought, gosh, when was the last time that I did think about my own white privilege? Or when was the last time that, I thought about racism and how racial injustice affects me? And I was reminded about some of the conversations that I had last year about taking time out to listen to the experiences of my Black friends, to really listen and hear and engage with Black people and their experiences in the UK, to not try and diminish them or justify them, and what it really looked like to be a white ally, to speak up when my Black friends felt tired and exhausted at seeing yet another violent act committed against someone who shared the same skin colour as them. So I would, to those of you watching who are white and feel confronted by some of the conversations that we've had here today, I'd say just take a pause, take a step back, and engage and listen again. It's not too late to start now. If this is the first video that you've watched about racial injustices and racism, that's okay, but don't let this be your last. I guess we're going to be having a lot of resources available as well. So yeah, I'd like to open that up. Is there anything kind of parting that you'd like to say?
I would offer just some book recommendations. Three in particular. So I already mentioned Black and British, David Olusoga, definitely. I think for a history of the Black British experience would be a great place to start. And it's a huge read, so take your time with it. Don't feel like you need to speed through it. There's a video companion series, BBC series as well, with that, which can be great to maybe watch first before reading the book, or do both alongside each other. Secondly, Ben Lindsay has a book, We Need to Talk About Race. He actually gave a talk at St. Paul's Cathedral with some other Black British figures. I'm trying to remember when. It was pre-COVID, so I want to say 2019. So that talk would be good to watch, but also his book would be great to read as well. And the last would be Jamar Tisby. He's a historian, social activist in the US. He recently released a book called How to Fight Racism. And that's a very sort of on the ground, practical approach to considering the topic of race, racial injustice, racial reconciliation. And so I think on the question of, what are the practical, tangible things that can be done moving forward for the cause of the gospel and for the cause of social progress, he offers very, I think, tangible applications there.
Yeah, those would be the three I think I'd point to as well. And maybe just to address those who aren't Christians, and some of this, especially when it comes to Christianity, some of this you agree with, like, yes, racism is bad, but perhaps you'd say, actually, I don't need Christianity to fight it. I'd say, yeah, you're probably right. you don't need to be a Christian to fight racism. And I'd actually want to acknowledge that historically Christians have been responsible for like reprehensible racial crimes. But actually, I also want to say and have you understand that it's almost always, I think I'm willing to commit to always, it's always been as people have taken the Christian story more seriously that progress, racial progress, has been made. Like thinking of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, whether that's the kind of on the British side or the American side, and then the civil rights movement, like real racial progress has been made as people move towards the Christian story in humility, not away from it. And actually, yeah, to that question, how do you make progress on racism? My answer kind of is get to know Jesus, because he's the one who says that your problem is racism. Your problem is like you view one ethnic group as more significant than others. Yes, hatred is wrong, but your greatest problem is all of that stuff bubbles up from your heart. Like all of the brokenness, like has its root in our kind of in our heart, in the human heart. And so he doesn't excuse evil. He doesn't say, oh, it's fine, it's just your heart. He actually goes and takes it head on, at the cross, his crucifixion. I'm sure we'll hear more about that as the week goes on. But actually, that means that the basis of like fighting racism, rejecting white supremacy for the Christian is something that's cosmic, that is the person and work and words of Jesus Christ. And that means, because the destiny that's connected to Jesus Christ and what he says about the future, a world made new, that historically Christians have been willing to die in the fight against racism. And so Jesus doesn't just fight racism, he actually has the power to transform a human heart full of hate, so that with new hearts, we'd be willing to love to the point of death, just like he did. That's the Christian story, that God so loved us, regardless of who we are, regardless of what we've done, loved us so deeply that he gave his son. And that's how we make progress, from what I can see, from what I understand. We get to know Jesus. And so that's where I'd like to leave it, with those three great recommendations from Israel as well.
Thank you, Elliot and Israel, so much for joining us for this panel. Again, this is a big topic, as we've said multiple times, but it is important. And I hope you found it helpful as well, too, as part of our events week.